So, one of the, if not the most prominent historian on the Israeli-Palestinian war, Benny Morris, recently wrote an article published on Haaretz about how a genocide of the Palestinian people is pretty much inevitable. And it was quite a disturbing article, but it wasn't really surprising because I have foreseen this myself. You have this very, very deep and violent conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and talk of genocide, talk of exterminating the other grows more and more common. And so I want to read to you guys one line from the article written by Benny Morris. He says here, October the 7th was the peak event in priming Jewish hearts and minds for genocide, and the genocide will apparently come at some point. And he says in this article that eventually there's going to be an event that will give the Jews a sense of justification to exterminate the Palestinians. And they're talking already about sending in 1.5 million Palestinians into Egypt and Jordan. And when you see this sort of talk, you may think, well, they're not talking about genocide. They're not saying we want to do a genocide. They're simply talking about mass deportations. Well, guess what? And Benny Morris references this. He makes a note of this in his article. Before the Nazis exterminated the Jews, they were talking about deporting the Jews, and they sent a whole bunch of Jews into the Holy Land. Yes, the Nazis actually, not because they really believed in the Zionist cause, but because they wanted to get rid of the Jews, but the Nazis actually did assist in the Zionist project, albeit temporarily, but they did send Jews to the Holy Land with the intent of getting rid of the Jews in Germany. And eventually they started to deport the Jews into Poland. And then once the war between the Germans and the Soviet Union really spiraled downwards and became a big disaster for the Germans, and it was quite clear that the Germans were losing, the Germans said, okay, we're fighting this very bloody war with the Soviets. The Jews are basically synonymous with communists. The Jews are the spreaders, they are the source of communism, and they are helping the partisans fight against us. We are going to exterminate the Jews. And thus began the Holocaust, thus began the genocide of the Jews. So you hear all this talk about doing mass deportations of Palestinians. Rest assured, there is an intention of genocide behind the curtains. And this is what Benny Morris is trying to shed light upon. And so he says that there's going to be an event that will provoke the Jews to the point where they're going to say, now we are justified to exterminate the Palestinians. And Benny Morris goes so far as to say that the Israelis may actually have extermination camps to butcher the Palestinians in. It's very, very dark, but Benny Morris is not really the most pro-Palestine guy. He's a Zionist. Over a year ago, at least, I wrote an article called The Extermination of the Semitic Race. And in this article, I described a possible scenario that would lead up to a genocide of the Palestinians and eventually into a genocide of the Jewish people in Israel. And the scenario went something like this. The Palestinians are going to be genocided by the Jews because the Jews are going to say, well, we have to get rid of all these terrorists, and the Palestinians are a problem. We have to get rid of them. We have to exterminate them. We have to purge them out of the Holy Land. Besides, this land belongs to us anyway. The Jews have been here for thousands of years, so this land is our land. And the Jews are going to genocide the Palestinians. And this is going to spur external powers, countries like Turkey, like Iran, to say, look at what the Yahud is doing. Look at what the Jews are doing to our fellow Muslims. They are exterminating our Palestinian brothers and sisters. We have to be their savior. And the idea of genociding the Jews will become very, very popular. And another Holocaust of the Jews will happen, will occur. And I said this in my article. And now you have Benny Morris, one of the, if not the most prominent historian on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, saying pretty much the same thing. Because in this article, he says that a genocide of the Palestinians will make the idea of genociding the Jews very, very popular. And there will be a push to genocide the Jews in Israel. Now, he doesn't make any sort of suggestions for who could do this Holocaust in the future. He doesn't say, well, it could be Turkey, it could be Iran. But I believe that Turkey will be the main country, if not one of the main countries, to work to do the second Holocaust. And with this, I am reminded of a story in the Old Testament. This is a story that is in 2 Samuel chapter 21. And this story really, really resonates with what's happening. And it really, really parallels with what the Jews, the radical, fanatical Jews, I want to make that very clear, want to do. King Saul, the very violent and tyrannical king, he wanted to exterminate what was left of the Canaanites, the remnant of the Canaanites in Israel. And there was a group of Canaanites in Israel. They were called the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites were Canaanites who had made a truce or an alliance with Joshua when Joshua was conquering Canaan. And they had made a pact with the Israelites, and the Israelites honored this pact until King Saul was ruling Israel. And the Bible tells us in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 21 that King Saul felt zeal for Israel. In his zeal for Israel, he began to orchestrate a genocide of the Gibeonites. Saul sought to slay them in his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah. So King Saul said, I am a proud Israelite. These Gibeonites do not belong in my land. This land belongs to the Jews. And so King Saul had this fanatical Zionist way of thinking. And so in this fanatical ideology of his, he commenced a genocide of the Gibeonites. And God hated this. He hated this. So he cursed Israel with a famine that lasted for 3 years. And King David, he was ruling Israel at this time. And he was wondering, why is there a famine? Why is there a famine in the land? The reason why there was a famine was because before King David was the king, before he became the king, King Saul had done a genocidal policy on the Gibeonites. And so David is wondering, why is there this famine? And why has this famine lasted for 3 years now? So he goes to God and he says, God, why is there this famine? Why have you struck us with this famine? And God says, it is because of what King Saul did when he butchered the Gibeonites in his zeal for Israel. So here was King Saul, a nationalist Israelite, who in his nationalism and for his nationalist cause butchered the Gibeonites. And God hated that. He hated King Saul's violent ultra-nationalism. And so he cursed Israel with a famine. And so King David says, well, God, what should I do to have you have mercy on us? And God says, well, it's because of what King Saul did. So King David goes to the Gibeonites. He goes to the elders of the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites say to King David, well, allow us to execute 7 of King Saul's male descendants. And King David gathers 7 of King Saul's male descendants, and he hands them over to the Gibeonites, and they have them hung. And God lifts the famine out of Israel. He gets rid of the famine. The point being that this ideology of wanting to do genocide, this ideology of fanatical Zionism, which wants to do genocide on the Palestinians, is antichrist. And God hates it. And it's right there in the Old Testament. They keep saying, oh, God gave the Jews the land. You have these evangelicals who come around and they say, well, God gave them the land. It's their land. And so if Israel, this is what I hate about evangelicals. If Israel does war crimes, and if you tell these evangelical loonbins about these war crimes, they will always say, I don't believe it, or those Palestinians deserve it. And this is why I say a lot of these evangelical Zionist types are evil. Hegseth, Schmuckabee, Huckabee, Rubio, Ted Cruz, they're all evil. All these people are evil. And that's why I say that they're evil, because if you tell them about Israeli war crimes, they don't care. They don't give a damn. And you can read about Israeli war crimes. You can read about how Israeli snipers will kill civilians for sport, and how you will have Israeli soldiers literally competing over who can kill the most people, and they will open fire on civilians during these competitions. Haaretz did a whole article on this. You can read about it. It's all there. But if you tell these evangelical lunatics about these war crimes, they will always be dismissive, or they will say, well, those people deserve it. And they will sit there and quote the Bible, and they'll bring up, oh, well, God gave them the land, the book of Exodus, the book of Joshua. But they don't look at this one simple story in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 21, in which God curses Israel for being fanatical Zionists. And King Saul does a genocide on the Gibeonites, and these Gibeonites were Canaanites. And you could sit there and say, well, the land doesn't belong to the Canaanites. God gave the land to the Jews. You could make those arguments, and King Saul was making those very arguments to justify his genocide. God didn't care. Because you know what God really cares about at the end of the day? Justice and mercy. And so King Saul, what was he doing? You can just imagine it. He was reading the Torah. He was reading the Old Testament. He was reading the verses that said, well, God gave the land to Abraham, and God will drive out the Canaanites, and God ordered Joshua to drive out and to exterminate the Canaanites. He looked at all those verses. He looked at those stories, and so he said, I have a right. I am entitled to genocide those people because the land does not belong to them. It belongs to me. It belongs to my people. And that's why in the book of 2 Samuel it says, in his zeal for Israel and Judah. And what does God tell David? After David asks God, why do we have this famine? God said, and I'll read it to you guys. It's in verse 1 of chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. It says, and the Lord answered, it is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. And so what does this tell us at the end of the day? What it tells us is that at the end of the day, you can sit there and you can worship the letter of the law. You can be hyper analytical on the letter of the law all you want. It is the spirit of the law that God cares about at the end of the day. And what does Jesus tell the religious leaders of Judea? He says, you worship the letter of the law, but you ignore the spirit of the law. And how does Christ define the spirit of the law? Justice and mercy. And that's truly what this is about at the end of the day. King Saul probably had I can guarantee you, he had a very convincing argument as to why he should genocide the Canaanites. He had all these verses. Kill the Canaanites, drive them out. The land doesn't belong to them. The land belongs to you guys, to the Jews, because of the pact that God made with Abraham. He had all the right answers. But he was absent of justice and mercy. And in his absence of justice and mercy, he had what? Zeal for Israel. He had Zionism. He had Zionism. And in his Zionism, he butchered the Gibeonites. And God didn't sit there and say, well, you know, King Saul, good work, my faithful servant. Good work, my faithful servant. You did my work. You did the work of Yahweh. I'm going to bless you. The land belongs to you. It doesn't belong to those inferior heathens, those savages. No, God cursed not only Saul, he cursed Israel with a famine. The whole country got cursed. And so that's the thing about the Bible. This is the thing about the Bible that's just an enigma to a lot of people. And it's even an enigma to me. And that is that you look at the Bible and you have all these verses. You'll have a whole plethora of verses that will essentially say the same thing, right? The land belongs to Israel, belongs to Israel, belongs to Israel. And there's so many that it's really easy to convince yourself that Zionism is the way to go for Christians and for Christianity. And that's why you have so many Christians who are Zionist, so many evangelicals who are hardcore Zionists, because there are so many verses that talk about Israel and the land of Israel. But then you will have these little verses, right? These short verses, and they may seem minuscule to you, and they do, right? Just at the surface level, they seem very minuscule. They seem, I don't want to say insignificant, but they seem to be just way too brief. And so we read them and then we say, oh, okay, that's nice. And we just brush them over and we keep on going. And we continue on in our Zionism or whatever crazy ideology that we get so caught up in. And then when someone says, no, you're wrong, you feel like you're right. Why? Because you have 1,000 verses that back you up. But when you actually look at those brief, short stories in the Bible, or those brief and short verses that seem very obscure to us in general, and you actually take the time to look into them, what you find is that these verses have such a depth to them that you could write a whole library on them. It's like the tip of the iceberg. It's like it seems as if these verses are puddles to us, little tide pools to us. But when you actually take the time to look into them, you find that they are a whole ocean of wisdom. And so you look at all these verses that talk about, Israel and the Jews, and you think, oh wow, Zionism, yeah, it's the truth. And then what happens? You go down the road of Ted Cruz. You become a Ted Cruz. You become a Schmuckabee, Huckabee. You become a Rubio. You become a Ted Cruz. You become a John Hagee, right? You become a Jonathan Kahn the con man. You go down that road. You become like those people, and that's why those people end up the way they do. And that's why all their followers end up the way they do, because there's so much verses that talk about Israel. But then there are these verses there that seem small, but they remind us of something. They remind us that our focus is not to be on the things of the flesh. And what do I mean by the things of the flesh? The nation, race, blood, bloodlines, genetics. But rather our attention should be on what? The spirit of the law. And so people talk about, oh, well, these verses talk about Israel and the Jews and then this and then that. But then you go to the New Testament and you read what Paul says, and he talks about how we are of the Jerusalem that is up on high. We are in the midst. We are in the cloud of all these saints. And he starts to name all these saints, Elijah and all these warriors of ancient Israel. And he says, we are amongst these people. We are of the Jerusalem in heaven, the Israel of heaven. And you read the Old Testament, and God is talking about how we have to circumcise ourselves spiritually and how we have to circumcise our hearts. And then you read about, well, you have King David and you have Uriah. Uriah is not racially a Jew, yet Uriah was more righteous than King David. And then you read the verse in which King David is in a civil war. He's fighting with his son Absalom. And Absalom and David, they're both Israelites. They're both racially the same people. But what does the Bible say? It says, and all of Israel sided with who? Not with David, with Absalom. Absalom, who was evil. And who sided with David? A small minority of the Israelites, and the Bible specifically says that it was the Levites who sided with King David. And Philistines. Philistines were who? They were Europe, some sort of an Indo-European people, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And they were one of Israel's biggest nemesis. They were a major enemy of Israel. And what does the Bible say? It says, and the only people who sided with David were who? Some Levites, so some Israelites, and a bunch of Philistines, Gentiles. And what does the Bible say? It says, and King David warred against Israel. Whoa, hold on. I thought we were supposed to be pro-Israel. I thought we were supposed to be, praise and worship Israel, John Hageeism Christianity. I thought we were supposed to be a bunch of Hagees and Hegseths and Schmuckabees and Rubios and Cruzes, and I thought we were supposed to be like those people. But we have King David fighting against who? Israel. And who did God stand with? Israel or David and his Gentile/Philistine allies? God stood with King David and the Philistines who stood with David. Were the Philistines racially Jewish? No. They were some sort of a Gentile race. They were, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Philistines were a European type of people. I could be wrong about that, but it doesn't matter. They were not genetically Jewish. So here we are, where we obsess over bloodlines and genes, and that's all the flesh. That's all bodies. And the whole time the Bible is there to remind you, that's not what that's about. It's about what? Justice, mercy. God did tell Joshua to kill all of the Canaanites. That's true. But what happened when the Gibeonites went to Joshua and they said, Joshua, have mercy on us, spare us? What did Joshua do? He spared them. He had mercy on the Gibeonites. He didn't, no, God told me to exterminate all of you. I'm going to follow the rule. I'm going to follow the letter of the law. That's not what Joshua did. He followed the spirit of the law, justice and mercy. Because the Canaanites, who did not want peace with Joshua, they were evil. Cannibals. They were doing human sacrifice. They were into all sorts of demonic things. The book of Wisdom gives us a very graphic description of the Canaanite religion, how they would take people into caves at night and cut them up, and they would drink blood and eat flesh and kill their own children. It was all demonic stuff. But this one tribe of Canaanite, the Gibeonites, they go to Joshua and they say, have mercy on us. And there is a prostitute who goes to the Israelites during the Exodus, and she says, have mercy on me and my family. Did they exterminate her? Did they kill her and her family? No. And she says, we want to work with you because we heard of the miracles that God did for you during the Exodus. And so the knowledge of God's miracles for the children of Israel, it spread in the Middle East. It spread in the Near East. And so that was a witness. It was a witness to the pagan people of the true God. And so God gave them a chance. And so Joshua made peace with the Gibeonites. He didn't sit there and say, nope, I have to follow the letter of the law. No, he followed the spirit of the law. And it's such an amazing story. It's in the book of Joshua. The Canaanite tribes that hated the children of Israel, they found out that the Gibeonites had made a treaty with Joshua. And so they say amongst themselves, let us go and exterminate the Canaanites of Gibeon. And so they go towards the Canaanites of Gibeon to exterminate them. They wanted to do the very evil that King Saul wanted to do in the future, which was to exterminate the Gibeonites. And so they go towards the Gibeonites. And what do the Gibeonites do? They go to Joshua and they say, Joshua, save us. And Joshua is who? He is a precursing figure of Jesus Christ. He is a precursor to Jesus Christ. Even the name Joshua, it's Jesus. Yeshua. Yeshu. And so they go to Joshua and they say, Joshua, save us. And what does Joshua do? Does he say, oh, no, you guys are heathens, you're inferior to us, no, I'm not going to help you. In fact, I'm supposed to exterminate you guys, so I should just let these heathen Canaanites exterminate you, because I'm going to exterminate those Canaanites anyway. I might as well just let them do some of the job for me. No, that's not what Joshua does. He goes to war to defend those people, and he defends the Gibeonites. And during the battle, there is this epic battle in the book of Joshua in which the Israelites are fighting these Canaanites to defend a Canaanite tribe. And the sun starts to go down, and Joshua says, sun, stand still. And he looks at the moon and he says, moon, stand still. And the sun and the moon stood still. And what does the Bible say describing that battle? It says, there was no other battle like it in the history of Israel. It was the most epic battle that Israel had ever fought. So the most epic battle that Israel had ever fought was a battle to defend Canaanites. And then decades and decades and decades later, many decades later, King Saul is ruling Israel. And what does he say? He says, I, a proud Israelite, am entitled to exterminate the Gibeonites. So he wanted to do the very evil that the other Canaanites, that the Canaanites who Joshua fought against wanted to do. So he becomes the heathen. He becomes the barbarian. And in his barbarism, he begins to exterminate the Gibeonites, and God curses Israel with a famine. And then King David says, God, why is there a famine? And God says, because of Saul's bloody house. And because of what he did to the Gibeonites. And so 7 of the male descendants of King Saul are executed, and the famine is lifted. But the story shows justice and mercy prevails over worshiping the letter of the law. So you have these fanatics in Israel today, and they're just like King Saul. In their Zionism, they feel justified to do what? To do a genocide. And so I fear that there's going to be an event, and Benny Morris says this in his article, there's going to be an event that's going to spark so much hatred and rage in Israel that the Israelis are going to say, now we are justified to do a genocide. And they're going to quote the Talmud, they're going to quote the Old Testament, they're going to make arguments that sound really, really good to religious Jews and to evangelical lunatics. And you're going to have people, and I believe this is going to happen, and you're going to have people saying, well, those Palestinians deserve it. And those Palestinians are terrorists. They deserve it. Every single genocide, and I've said this before, every single genocide in history was done under some sort of a pretext or some sort of a justification. It was done under an argument that seemed very legitimate, and it was used to justify whatever genocide you pick in history. So, for example, you look at the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide was justified how? Because you had Armenian terrorists, and they were doing acts of terrorism in the Ottoman Empire. And in one case, a bunch of Armenian terrorists took over a bank, and they took the bank hostage, and they said, well, we want to free Armenia. And you had cases of Armenians killing civilians in the Ottoman Empire. Yes, you can look into this. The Holocaust. Now we're getting into a very sensitive subject. The Holocaust. The Nazis had arguments to justify the Holocaust. And at that time in Germany, those arguments seemed legitimate. But they weren't. But they seemed legitimate. And what were their arguments? Well, a lot of the communists are Jews. And was not the Soviet Union butchering millions of people? I mean, everyone brings this up all the time. Every conservative you talk to nowadays brings this up. Well, the Soviet Union, they were worse than Hitler. They killed so many millions of people. And that's what the Nazis were pointing to when they were justifying the Holocaust. They said, look at the Red Terror. Look at how many people the Soviets are butchering. Look at the people that the Leninists are butchering, the Bolsheviks are butchering. And they pointed to facts. And you could read about post-World War I Germany and how they were communists in Germany who wanted to do revolutions. And they did do revolutions, communist revolutions in Germany. In Munich, they did one. They did the Spartacist revolution. And these communists wanted to make Germany into basically a satellite state for the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks. And so, and in those days, if you were a German living in those days, you would be terrified. You'd be thinking, oh my God, I don't want to be under the Red Terror. We need a savior figure. In comes Hitler. And you see, this fact of the Holocaust, that the Holocaust was done under a pretext or under a series of pretexts, this fact is not talked about a lot. And the fact that it's not talked about a lot is a disservice to the study of history and really to the study of the Holocaust. Why do I say this? Because the reason why we study the Holocaust is to prevent another Holocaust. It's to prevent genocide. That's why we study these things, even though we've had numerous genocides already, and they took place after the Holocaust. But still, the purpose of studying genocides is so that we can prevent genocides. We don't sit there and study genocides because they make really good material for very dark films. We study genocides to prevent genocides. And so when it comes to the Holocaust, there is a presentation of the Holocaust that I find very troublesome, and that is Hitler one day woke up and said, I hate the Jews, I want to kill them. And this is really the way that the Holocaust has been presented for decades, that the Germans just woke up, they said, well, Germany really sucks right now. The economy really sucks. We just went through World War I. Tons of Germans died. Millions of Germans died. We need someone to blame. Let's blame the Jews. And that's partially true, but that's not the full picture. There were events that took place in post-World War I Germany that got the Germans thinking, wow, we really need to get rid of the Jews. You had several scandals that were done, major scandals like the Sklarek scandal. You had the Spartacist Revolution. You had the Munich Revolution, in which you had Marxists doing a revolution to overthrow the local government. They took over Munich, and there were Jewish people that were involved. I'm not saying it was all Jews, but there were, in fact, Jewish people who were involved in that. You could look at the Leninist Revolution and how that led to tons of people being murdered in Russia, and the Leninists, they were ran by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, who was Jewish. All these things were pointed out. Trotsky was Jewish, right? All these realities were known in Germany, and the Nazis capitalized on all of these troublesome realities, and they said, well, look, the Jews are a problem in your country. We are going to save them. We're going to save you, not them. We are going to save you from them. And that's why you look at videos of Hitler's speeches and people are losing their minds because they were facing a rising Bolshevik terror. They were terrified. And it's not like the Bolsheviks were super far away from Germany. They were right next door. And a lot of them were in Germany already, and they were doing terrorist attacks. Go look up Eugene Levine. He was a Jewish guy who was a socialist Marxist terrorist who wanted Germany to be a Soviet state. So you had all these facts. And the reason why it's so troublesome that these facts are not talked a whole lot about is because when we talk about events today that parallel those times, people say, no, our times are so different. In those days, in the time before the Holocaust, Hitler was just a madman who decided to kill the Jews, and that was that. But we don't talk about the facts that the Nazis were pointing to justify the genocide of the Jewish people. And the reason why this is so dangerous is because by us not talking about them, by us not talking about this reality, we don't understand that genocide is always justified by facts. Genocide is always presented as a good solution under the pretexts of certain facts. All genocides are done under pretexts. And so the Israelis, who are fanatics, who want to genocide the Palestinians, they have a pretext. The pretext is, we need to fight terrorism. A lot of terrorists are amongst the Palestinians. The Palestinians hate us. They have a culture of terrorism. And this is all true, by the way. It's all true. And because it's true, genocide seems like a great idea to a lot of people. And this is what makes arguments in favor of genocide so dangerous. They always present real problems. The Nazis presented real problems. They said, well, we have communism. We have Marxists and Bolsheviks amongst us, and they want to force us to be under communism. We can't allow that to happen. And so what was their solution? Exterminating the Jews, because they associated Jews with communism. And so the Holocaust seemed like a great idea to a lot of people in Germany. And this dark reality, the dark reality that genocide is always done under a pretext, is not talked about so much, and it's quite horrendous that it's not talked about enough. Why do I say this? Because when you try to warn people about another Holocaust happening, what do they always say? Oh, no, Israel would never want to do a genocide of the Palestinians because Israel is only trying to fight terrorism. Well, if you were to rewind back to the 1930s, and if you were to tell people, well, the German nationalists, they want to do a genocide of the Jews, you could have said the same thing. No. The German nationalists only want to fight communism. That's their problem. Their problem is communism, and they want to fight communism. In fact, when the Germans were doing the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, they would take records of the people that they were killing, and they would say, well, we killed this many communists. We killed this many Bolsheviks. And so everything seemed like it was just a war against communism. And at the surface, it was, right? They were fighting the Soviet Union. But there was an underlying motivation underneath it. And that was this social Darwinist, eugenist aspiration of creating German Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe. And getting rid of the Slavs because they thought the Slavs were subhumans. But underneath this genocide was this pretext, and the pretext was we must fight communism. And on paper, at the surface, that seems like a noble cause. It seems like a good idea. Yeah, communism, F communism. Yeah, communism is evil. Got to get rid of it. But when they were carrying out this war against communism, they were doing genocide. In the case of fanatical Zionism, the fanatic Zionists will say, well, we are fighting terrorists. And they are fighting terrorists, right? Hamas is a terrorist organization. But underneath this war, underneath this conflict, is this underlying motivation of removing Palestinians because you have these fanatical Jews who see them as inferior, and they believe that these Palestinians are not even human beings. And Benny Morris in his article talks about how a lot of Israelis have dehumanized the Palestinians, and how this view of the Palestinians as non-human is becoming more and more popular. So the environment that is conducive for genocide is scarily growing rapidly. But it is so dangerous that we do not understand that genocides are always done under pretexts. And those pretexts point to real problems. And the reason why this is so dangerous is because if you want to warn people about a coming genocide, and if you want to say, hey, look, this reminds me of Adolf Hitler, people will say what? No, Hitler just got up and decided to kill people. He was just this madman who never pointed to real problems. And that wasn't the case. People just don't understand that what deceived the Germans is what is deceiving all these fanatics in Israel, is what is deceiving all these evangelicals who will praise Israel even when Israel is doing war crimes. And that deception is the mass killing of a people is necessary because it's for a noble cause. If it's the case of the Nazis, it was the noble cause of fighting communism. If it's the case of fighting, or if it's the case of the fanatical Zionists, it's the noble cause of fighting terrorism. And so because people don't understand that genocide is done under a set of facts, or genocide is presented as a solution to real problems, people fall for the deception, they fall for the arguments that are utilized to justify genocide. And this is why it's so dangerous to simply present Hitler as a madman who woke up and decided to kill a bunch of people. Because the reality was Hitler murdered people, or the Nazis, the Third Reich, did mass murder under a pretext. And you have fanatics in Israel who want to do a genocide under a pretext. And people don't understand this reality. They think, well, Hitler was just a madman. Our leader is not a madman. No, no, no. Your leader wants to do genocide. I'm not saying Netanyahu. I'm saying whoever is going to do the next genocide is not going to be a madman. He's going to be someone who's going to give you arguments that sound convincing. And because they will sound convincing to you, you will, and because they will sound convincing to you, when someone comes to you and says, no, 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 you're just like the Germans when they followed Hitler, you're going to say, no, 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 the Germans followed a madman. I'm not following a madman. And the reality will be that you are following someone who is using a pretext to justify mass murder, just as the Third Reich used a pretext to justify their own genocide. You guys just got some theology. God bless.